Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò for this event in collaboration with the Department of Italian Studies and NYU's Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. I am Eugenio Refini, I'm the chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm very happy to be briefly introducing this event because for the formal introduction I will make the most of my dear colleague Ida Caiazza, more on that front in a second, but I just want to say that we have been thinking about this event for a while, and our guests tonight, who will be duly introduced in a moment, are also friends of many of us, wonderful scholars, but also two of the, sort of kind of colleagues with whom it's such a pleasure to be sharing work and research. And of course, this has been, in my case, true, over the years of both Julia and John. And to have them together tonight is really a special treat for me personally, and certainly is going to be a treat for everybody. And, we are discussing an important work of the Renaissance. We have titled this event a rediscovered Renaissance epic because that's exactly what the Wretch by Tullia d'Aragona is. But of course, this is also a work which has been partly a labor of love, I guess, because both Julia and John have been working on this project for a long time because it's a long poem, and as many Renaissance epics is pretty thick, right? You can see. It's a very voluminous book. But of course, it also raises the question of women's writing in the Italian Renaissance, particularly in the 16th century, and I think Tullia really embodies, one of these wonderful voices, which for various reasons, even historical and historiographical reasons, have been silenced over the following centuries. And thanks to the work of scholars such as Julia Hairston and John McLucas and many others, have been gradually rediscovered. And I cannot think of a better person to introduce the evening and moderate the conversation than my colleague Ida Caiazza, assistant professor here in the Department of Italian Studies, very well known to many of you, and she's a specialist of Renaissance literature, broadly meant, but with a very strong focus on women's writing, gender studies, and the history of emotions, and I'm sure we will be in very capable hands in terms of dealing with the unfolding of the evening. So I would like to give an applause to the three of them, Julia Hairston, John McLucas, and Ida Caiazza, and I will hand it over to Ida.
Thank you so much, Eugenio. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, Renaissance Epic Rediscovered. So, as Eugenio mentioned, I'm Ida Caiazza. I'm an assistant professor of Italian, and it is truly a joy to be here tonight, and especially to see so many of our department's students, both graduate and undergraduate, in the audience. And this is particularly meaningful to me because in this very building, actually in this very room, here I'm teaching this semester a course on epic literature and another on women's writing. So this event feels like a perfect expression of Casa Italiana's best tradition, bringing together a broader public with our community of scholars and students. And especially for this fortunate coincidence, I'm very happy to introduce our speakers tonight. Julia Hairston is a scholar of early modern Italian literature and history, and over the years she has focused in particular on gender configurations in Italian Renaissance authors such as Alberti, Castiglione, Ariosto, and Machiavelli. And she's also has a remarkable ability to bring scholars together around innovative and important questions, as is evident from her co-edited volumes on gender, the body, women as readers in early modern Italy, as well as from her now long-running and very successful cycles of conferences on early modern Rome. And most importantly for tonight's event, Julia has devoted a lot of energy and intellectual acumen, at least over the past 20 years, even more, I think, to Signora Tullia d'Aragona, tonight's star, Julia has written Tullia's biography, edited and translated her poems and letters, searched the archives and uncovered wonderfully rich documents about dowries, newly discovered poems by Tullia and figures who appear in her poems. And finally, just last year, she published this thin volume containing Tullia's poem on Guerrino Meschino, which is at the center of our conversation tonight. And this work was produced in collaboration with John McLucas, who is here with us as the translator of Tullia's Meschino, but John is also Professor Emeritus of Italian and Latin at the Department of Foreign Languages at Towson University. He has published extensively on Italian epic tradition, especially on Ariosto, but also on Tullia's Meschino. And in addition, he has translated a number of compelling texts, including 16th century Latin documents about the first encounter between Europe and the Americas, and we should have an event sooner or later about that here. So together, these two extraordinary scholars crossed paths to work on what is believed to be the first epic romance published in Italian by a woman, Tullia's Meschino or the Wretch. And this is certainly Tullia d'Aragona's magnum opus, but in a sense also Julia's and John's magnum opus, and we are deeply honored to have them both here today, certainly to talk about Tullia and the Meschino, but also about the scholarly journey that led to this book, a journey that itself feels a bit like an epic, lasting 2 decades, the same amount of time that Ulysses needed to fight the war of Troy and then make his way back to Ithaca. And now, before turning the floor over to Julia and John, so we will begin with a presentation by Julia, followed by a presentation by John, and then I'll have the pleasure of sitting down with them for a conversation, and after we'll open things up to all of you for a Q&A. But before we begin, especially since I have been talking with my students over the past couple of weeks about the often, as Eugenia was mentioning, sad fate of women's writing in the early modern period, and especially about how women's voices were not only forgotten, but in many cases actively erased, I thought it would be fitting to open tonight's event by allowing Tullia's own voice to resonate in this auditorium. So I will begin by reading in Italian the poem to Tullia's Meschino.
Lovely.
It's only 5 stanzas, so bear with me. L'eccelsa meraviglia, il valor vero, la virtù saggia, la religione, canto d'un franco e forte cavaliero, degno a star con ogni altro al paragone. Tu, celeste Signor, perfetto e vero, guida mia pura e casta intenzione, ch'io non invoco Febo, Euterpe o Clio, ma te, sommo Signor del mondo e Dio. De filosofi antichi e dei poeti non seguo l'orme, in altro loco parmi da dimostrar dei cieli bei segreti che dove son pellegrinaggi etarmi. Lo stile umili, accenti mansueti potranno appresso i più saggi scusarmi, poich'io non piglio a far tanto lavoro per gran desio di fama o premio d'oro. Chi de religion che ognor governa la terra e il ciel si trova il core accenso, chi con ogni pensier la patria eterna sempre in mente e il suo rettore immenso, chi con alta virtù vuol che si scerna, tenere il fren l'alma ragione al senso, da questo libro il pensier mai non mute, pien di religion, fede e virtute. Voi che pellegrinarvi dilettate e sapere i costumi altrui diversi, il modo da guerrin prima imparate, e di fuggire i falsi inganni avversi. Se la sorte fatal sentir cercate, in guerrin chiara ben potrà vedersi, e saprete conoscer quanto importe pellegrinar costumi, inganni e sorte. Mostrerà bianco il sito dell'inferno, che vi possiate procacciare in vita di scampare il dolore e il pianto eterno, e qual peccato a maggior duol vincita. Del purgatorio vi mostra il governo, e della gloria santa la via trita, sì che intender si può come è diviso l'inferno, il purgatorio e il paradiso. Please join me in welcoming Julia and John, and let's start the conversation.
So there are people there that. Thank you, Ida, very much for that, and thank you, Eugenio, and thanks to all of you for being here. And I wonder if maybe we should have John read that same thing in English, so that it's not.
That's
yeah.
a fantastic idea.
Bene. Can you see it?
Is this on? Yeah. I didn't rehearse this, but it was commovente to hear Tullia speak. I sing the lofty marvels, true value, wise virtue, and religion of a free, strong knight, worthy to be compared with any other. May you, heavenly Lord, perfect and true, guide my pure, chaste intention. For I do not invoke Phoebus, Euterpe, or Clio, but you, almighty Lord God of the earth. I do not follow in the footsteps of ancient philosophers and poets. It seems right to me to show heaven's beautiful secrets in another place. For where there are wanderings and deeds of arms, my humble style and gentle words may excuse me among the wise, since I do not undertake such a task from any great desire for fame or for any reward in gold. Any who find their hearts alight with religion, which always governs earth and heaven, any who always hold in mind their eternal homeland and its immeasurable ruler, any who wish to discern with lofty virtue how pure reason reigns in the senses, let them never turn their thoughts from this book, full of religion, faith, and virtue. All you who enjoy traveling and learning others' different customs, learn that habit first from Guerrino, and learn too how to flee false deceptions arrayed against you, if you seek to perceive destined fate. It will be clearly seen in Guerrino, and you will learn to know how important are travel, customs, deceptions, and fate. I will show you also the location of hell, so that while still alive you may obtain the chance to escape eternal pain and weeping. And whatever sin and greater suffering goads you, the way here trodden shows you also the realm of purgatory and of holy glory, so that one may understand how hell, purgatory, and paradise are organized.
So I'm going to take a step back and just say something a little bit about the biography of Tullia, because this is her last work, but she's quite interesting in the fact that she published 3 works, 3 different genres in her life. And the first was the Dialogue on the Infinity of Love, which is oftentimes taught. Some of you may have read it, I think, in classes on love discourses. And in that, she is obviously writing in prose. At the same year, and that was published in 1547, the same year after that, she published what we call a choral anthology. So it is a songbook in the nature of, it's a volume of poems, but it is organized very differently than sort of a Petrarchan. It has a series of different authors who contributed to it. And she organized it in such a way, or the person who put it together, we don't really know. One of the problems with 16th century publications is oftentimes we don't have manuscripts of initial text because they were destroyed once the book was published. And it's organized in that it's got 5 sections to it. The first section is her writing in praise of others. It starts with the political section. She's in Florence at the time, so she writes to Duke Cosimo de' Medici, then to Eleonora, then to other members of the family. The second section is what we call correspondence poetry. So it's a proposta, a proposal sonnet, and then the person who's being written to then responds in turn. And the second section is one in which she writes a proposal sonnet to lots of different, all men, some of them very well known, other poets and different sorts of people, political figures in the many cities in which she lived, but I'll get to that in a second. I just wanted to talk about her work first. Then the third section are proposals that were written by others to her that she responds to, and these are all published one in front of the other, one on top of the other, let's say. The fourth section is an egloga written by Girolamo Muzio, who was one of her biggest literary proponents, and most of the biographical information that we have on her, except for the things that we pulled out of the archives, come from that text, such as the fact that she was born in Rome. And then the final section are poems written in praise of her. And here, the lead is taken from the 1535 edition of Bembo's poetry, in which he, at the end of his, or maybe it was 38, at the end of it, he collects a series of poems that are written to him, and he indicates which poems that he wrote in his volume were in response to them. What Tullia's is very different. It sort of preconfigures what we know as a different genre of Italian lyric poetry in the 16th century, which is called the temple, the tempio. So after that, many years pass, and this poem that we're talking about today was published in 1561, posthumously, because Tullia died in 1556. Okay, so going back to who's Tullia? Tullia is primarily known as a courtesan. She was called appropriately so by one of her early biographers, Georgina Masson. She was called the intellectual courtesan. She was known from early on for writing poetry. She was very famous in her day. There are many, and she had many people who wrote about her and thought she was the best thing since sliced bread, and other people who instead thought that she was horrid, as most courtesans might be, and was vituperated largely by people like Pietro Aretino, but also Firenzuola and other authors. She sort of has two phases to her life, at least in the way that I see it, and the dividing line is 1537. The reason why is because 1537 was the year that Duke Alessandro de' Medici, the first Duke of Florence, was assassinated by his cousin. And in that same year, the group of political exiles who wanted to help Florence regain the Republic, because it had been going back over the course of several decades between an oligarchy of the Medici and what they called a republic, what was really another oligarchy. Tullia, for many years, was involved with the Florentine banker Filippo Strozzi. So for those of you who have been to Florence, you've seen Palazzo Strozzi. He's responsible for building that. He was incredibly rich and helped Tullia out a lot, and we have letters in which he talks about that, how much he enjoyed his time with her and how he helped her out when he could. Although this never really specified. In 1537, the two of them are in Ferrara. So Tullia was born in Rome, raised in Siena, which explains the sort of Tuscan language that she shows in the dialogue, which is in prose, because you can't really tell in the poetry of the time where someone necessarily is from, because they're using a Petrarchan language. And after that, she goes to Venice. She starts her career as a courtesan in Rome in the early 1520s, and after is seen in various places, both in Ferrara as well as in Venice. And in 1537, she's with Filippo Strozzi in Ferrara, and he leaves to go because he had become the idealized head of the fuoriusciti, these political exiles. And he, unfortunately, is captured at the Battle of Montemurlo, a small town in Tuscany. They are routed, the fuoriusciti are routed, and he gets put in prison in the Fortezza da Basso, which was a building in Florence that still exists today, that his money helped build. And ironically, he after a year and a half, he commits suicide in prison. And at this point, we have Tullia, soon after that, returning to Rome, and probably going to stay in the house of Bernardo Tasso, at least for the initial period. Thanks to Marcello Simonetta, who shared a letter with me. Tullia is returning to Rome with 14 caravans. So she was making a move. And it's after that we don't know really if she stayed in Siena or stayed in Rome the rest of that time. Well, hold on, I take that back. We do know. She then went to Siena, where she had been promised, in 1518, she had been promised a dowry when her mother married an illegitimate son of the noble Orlandini family. And in that document, Tullia is described as being a puella onesta, so an honorable young girl, and that's in 1518. So she, in 1543, returns to Siena in order to get this dowry. She takes a court case that goes first in one to one magistracy, and it gets thrown out. And she then marries and reapplies and is actually awarded the 800 florins after that. Haven't found yet a trace of payment of that, but anyway, I'm still looking. And soon after that, there's a lot of political unrest in Siena at the time, and so she goes to Florence. And this is where we have also the 8 autograph letters in her hand that the other sort of primary literary benefactor of hers, who was Benedetto Varchi, whom you may also have known because he also promoted the work of Laura Battiferra, for example. And he was a prime mover and shaker of Florentine cultural politics, and had been hired by Duke Cosimo to write the history of Florence. And he was a linguist, and he was a poet. And anyway, he chose to save these letters of Tullia, thank goodness. And so we now know what her handwriting looks like. And it's by the same letters that we learn that she leaves Florence in 1548, probably returning to Rome. And then another letter is mentioned in a sale catalog where she writes to Margherita d'Austria, who at that point was, who had been Alessandro de' Medici's first wife before he was assassinated, and then she ended up marrying into the Farnese family. And she is told by Tullia to thank her brother-in-law, who was Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, to allow Tullia to leave the adventurous life. Now, this is a letter that was an autograph letter that was sold in 1911, and it was among the papers of a paleographer from the Archivio di Stato in Rome. That's another thing I'm looking for. Still haven't found that yet. In it, so we know that she has a sinecure from Alessandro Farnese, and this, along with the 800 florins, would help describe and help explain how she was able to write a book like this. A note of length. This is 28,000 lines. 28,000 lines. The Divine Comedy is, I think, around 12,000. The Odyssey. 14, says Allison. Okay. The Odyssey is 12,000. So anyway, it took some time to write. We think she probably started writing it at the end of her time in Florence and then continued while she was in Rome after that. Okay, that's her biography. The second part of what I wanted to tell you in the 5 minutes that are remaining is that why is this epic important? I mean, for one, although we did not go so far as to call it the first ever epic written by a woman, we think it is. There is one, if you look on Joanne Cavallo's website of epics, there is the mention of one 13th century German poem which someone has surmised might have been written by a woman, but anyway, we know this was written by a woman. That's interesting, I think, in and of itself. And it heralded the number of different other epics written by other Italian women authors at the time. So Moderata Fonte, Margherita Sarocchi, Lucrezia Marinella, Francesca Turina Buffalini. Just to name a few. What Tullia does is to take a prose text written by Andrea da Barberino, a Tuscan author, and transpose it into verse. And if you don't feel like reading that whole book, just read the preface. The preface is a manifesto of what it is she's trying to do in the work. It explains why she does what she does and sort of how she conceives of her civic duty. The text is emblematic of the changes taking place in the first half of the 16th century in Italy and at mid-century, where you have the Council of Trent, the Counter-Reformation, and as you heard when John read the first part, she is not appealing to the muses, she's appealing to God. She explains that part of her duty is to take a work, because she goes on at length about the importance of reading, kind of we are what we read. And she explains here how she knows, for example, she who in her former life had an experience of the world that she wished she hadn't had, talking about her time as a courtesan. And so this book, it's her civic duty to offer honorable, virtuous reading to people, because reading really makes you who you are. She also, let's see, one of the other things that makes, I think, the text interesting is the aspect of, and makes it modern in some regards, is the fact that it is a search for identity. It is a search for origins, which is a common concept in epic poetry. But the protagonist, Guerrino, who is, as a baby, taken from his home and captured by pirates and then sold into slavery, is fortunately raised by a man who takes him to his wife because they had no children, and so he is raised as one of their own until they are then in fact have a child. Then he kind of gets pushed aside, but is allowed to receive an education, etc. He grows up in the court in Constantinople, in the court of the emperor, and the emperor's son takes a fondness to him, and he has great martial abilities as well. And then it's only at a certain point where he learns that he is in fact not the son of the person that he thought he was, and he decides to set off in search of his origins and travels, well, as Tullia says, almost the whole earth. Andrea, her source text, said that he traveled all over the world because, of course, his was written in 1420, and Tullia's was written later, so she knew better that there were other places in the world than what they knew at the time. Other interesting parts of the text, I think, is that she engages in many ways in sort of the big debate that takes place between Ariosto and Tasso, and she's at a midway point, and she is responsible for adopting certain methods of writing. She does include proems. You can see the influence of Aristotle's Poetics, where at this time, around the 1540s, we're starting to have greater influence, and that's when they had been known about before, but it's in the 1540s when they are vernacularized. So you can see some of that. She has a single virtuous hero, Guerrino. If you ask me, he's a little too virtuous. He's a bit, I think, I would almost want to say unlikable, absolutely unlikable, because he doesn't change. He never wavers. He's never tempted. You don't see him sort of struggle with things and learn from them, or make mistakes, which is also an important thing for a protagonist to do. So he's a little too virtuous for, I think, our taste, and really for, I think, good literary taste. But at any rate, one of the other most interesting things, and then I'm going to let John talk because I've been talking too long, is that she has this very interesting characteristic, which some people, there has been discussions about her authorship, which we can go into if you want, and later in the Q&A, but the gender of her narrator oscillates between male and female throughout the text, from the beginning to the end. Sometimes she speaks as a woman and she says she's a woman. Sometimes you can see it because of the adjectival endings, or because sometimes you can't see it because it's cut off, or it's a present tense or whatever. And it's systematic throughout the book. She adopts oftentimes the figure of the minstrel poet, and so that's her male voice is the minstrel poet. But at any rate, this is something that has given pause to critics in the past. I think I'll stop there. I have other things to say, but I would love to hear questions, and then we can make it a real conversation, which is what this was intended to be. Okay, thank you.
I don't think you talk too long. I always learn when I hear you talk, so I learned several very cool things in the past 10 minutes. Let me start before I forget with a couple responses. You didn't use, but we've used it in other contexts, the term gradus ad parnassum. And the concept in classical poetry, Greek and Roman poetry, that a poet would start as a young poet with something easy like lyric poetry, and then in the maturing process graduate to a higher, more complicated, lengthier genre of some kind, and then finally an epic as a mature artist. The classic example of that is Virgil, who writes the Eclogues as a young man, the Georgics in midlife, and one of the 10 greatest books of all time, the Aeneid, as a mature writer. And Tullia, the scholars much greater than I have studied the way women could be literary in early modern European society, but it was almost impossible for a gentlewoman or a respectable married lady to be very active intellectually. So you have virgins and you have courtesans and you have women who are somehow outside the normal standards of society who did achieve great intellectual feats. And we have Tullia, for example, following consciously in her career a gradus ad parnassum. This reminds us that our mutual colleague Diana Shemek, who's the world's expert on Isabella d'Este, if you want to talk about, Renaissance women with their immense, profound humanist learning and the great educations they had, Isabella d'Este is the first name that comes up, and deservedly so. But Diana told me, to my astonishment, Isabella did not know Latin. Knowing Latin was knowing grammatica and being Dante. You know, it's like it's not for the Marquesana di Mantova to do that. It would be unrespectable. Tullia had Latin books in her library at the time of her death, and she clearly is pursuing a Latin model of literary achievement. She also does interesting things to go micro. There are times when she, and I'll get back to her rhymes because I usually think they're awful, and I translate it into prose because I wasn't moved to attempt to match her rhymes. I would have felt that I was lowering myself in some cases to match her rhymes. But she rhymes Latin words with Italian words in ways that you have to think for a second to realize that she's using Latin. For instance, she uses intende to rhyme with rende or something like that. And you think, no, it should be intendi. Oh, wait, no, it's a prayer. This is the imperative of a third conjugation Latin verb, not the third person singular of an Italian verb. And speaking of her Tuscanness, this goes over my head, but there's some word that she uses which is not rospo, but it means toad, the little animal.
Botta.
Botta. And that is like screamingly Tuscan for her to use that word. So it's interesting of her life between Rome and between Tuscany. And one thing, I know Julia will mention the whole controversy about authorship, but one thing in which Tullia differs distinctly in several places from her source text, Andrea da Barberino, who wrote a prose romance called Guerrino, is that she knows the city of, whoever wrote the book, knows the city of Rome in much, much greater detail than Andrea did. And she uses correct terminology, like she says il Panteone, and Andrea says La Rotonda or something like that. So this is a person who knows Rome as a Latin-speaking, conscious, cultured person. To me, there is essentially no question that Tullia wrote this book. All of that said, I would kind of go back over my experience with translating this book. And I have to say, if you want to get a glowing 5-star review on a literary text, do not ask the person who translated it into a different language, because it's an infuriating process, and there are places where you just are beating your head against the wall, and I'll go into some of them. But we started the project in 2002, and in 2003, I had a sabbatical from Towson University and really plunged into the text, just with a pen and a yellow legal pad, and started translating. And there were several things that struck me. Early on, I said, I'm doing a prose translation, not a poetry translation, because the most important and interesting part of this book is not the versifying and the wordsmithing, but the story. So let's get the content of the story as clear as possible. In 2005, Cursietti published a critical edition of the Guerrino of Andrea, and I did a thorough revision of my draft translation, because there were literally hundreds of passages in which the prose of Andrea was absolutely clear in terms of its meaning, and the verse of Tullia had confused me. Confused to the extent that I felt like she's not really doing the job. Because, for instance, and I'll propose counter-arguments from my own condemnations, but these are my actual feelings. We all know Italian is much more flexible than English in putting the subject after the verb. So if somebody says, "I biglietti li a Mario," there's not one single thing to be corrected in that sentence. But if in a narrative poem you have "La donna vide Guerrino," and you gradually realize that Guerrino is the subject and he saw the woman, you're like, you're supposed to be telling me a story. And frequently, Tullia does that in order to make a rhyme. So she'll distort normal word order to create the possibility of a rhyme. And then she is very fast and loose. Poor Julia's heard these complaints before. Very fast and loose with the possessive adjective suo, which, because she knows Latin, suo could mean his, her, its, or their. And it does, all through the book. But frequently you're like, whose? If there are 7 people in the room and she says, "La sua spada," you think, and there's one where one of the, and then if there's no subject to the verb, just because it's included in the verb, there's one case where the 3 possible subjects would be this person, that person, or an elephant. And it's just, that's where a writer with a certain kind of expertise in Polish would have said, "L'elefante fece." But it's like you figure it out. Or you read Andrea, and frequently his more normal prose word order clarifies. So drastic revisions at that point when I had access to Cursietti's critical edition of Andrea. Another thing that actually favored this project for me was that my career at Towson was, it's a state comprehensive institution, and I was doing a lot of administration, and I was teaching language acquisition courses most of my career. I had no graduate program. If you're working on a long translation, it's a very good project to be constantly interrupted in, because the text is there, and you can get back to it when you're done talking to the student about the imperfect tense and the passato prossimo. So that was a real help, and it also helped me evaluate the poem as I went through, because I often found I never had a class that could read the Meschino, but I often had survey classes in which we could read 2 pages of the Meschino, and the students liked it better than I did. in many cases. For example, and by the way, I won't forget this example. I'll go back to it. But the character, his real name is Guerrino, but when he's sold into slavery and raised by kindly strangers, they call him il meschino, meaning the poor kid. So he doesn't know that his name is Guerrino until well into the book. And something very artful that Tullia does, which Andrea does not do, is that once he learns his real name is Guerrino, she phases out the use of the term meschino. So he's il meschino for most of the book, but once he's figured out through various miracles what his actual name is, she doesn't abruptly stop, but she phases it out almost as though it were sinking into him that his real name is Guerrino. No, I have forgotten the thing I crossed my fingers about. But I have notes. How am I doing on time? Okay, this is just this is just me being me, but I'm an Ariostista, and Ariosto is almost obnoxiously professional in his writing skill, in that you can read 50 pages of Ariosto out loud and you never, never, never miss the 11 syllables in each line, and you always know who's the subject and who's the object of the verb, and you're not stopped by gorgeous lines that really make you go, ooh, I'm going to have to tattoo that. You read and you get the story, and you kind of are thrust forward in this very expert way. And he is a brilliant rhymer. You know, Italian is the easiest rhyming language on earth. If you rhyme cantando with andando, it rhymes. That works. So every single gerund of every single first conjugation verb rhymes. Congratulations. But Ariosto does rhymes that make you, wow, that was, didn't see that coming, and that's really good. And one thing he does that I get a kick out of, and it's just me being like a smart high school kid who's learned a new thing, but the rima equivoca. He's brilliant at rhyming porta, meaning the door or the gate, with porta, meaning he, she, or it carries. Great trick. And I get a kick out of that, and Tullia doesn't do it. Tullia does the rima identica. And you heard in the very first octave, she rhymes vero, true, with vero, true. And that got a huge eye roll from me back in 2003 when I was starting. I said, honey, there are at least 50 words that rhyme with vero. And then I said, there could be an artistic intention here. I mean, she's emphasizing truth. She is saying, this is a true story. It's true. So, bene. And she does that several times, and I always find it kind of like, couldn't you think of a rhyme? And then, for no reason, a couple of weeks ago, for the first time since graduate school, I glanced at the Rime Petrose, and I said, oh, look, the first one, he rhymes amore, love, with amore, love. At the end of every stanza in that poem, you have a word rhyming with itself. So Tullia had a prestigious source for what I thought was kind of a poetic amateurishness, shall we say. She also has, and this is another reason I decided not to do an attempt of verse translation, she has two very distinct registers, and she intermingles them in ways that, as an Ariosto lover, I found a little awkward. But, you know, nobody's paying her to be Ariosto. And also he's unique in that he mingles in a very brilliant, genius way comic and serious registers. And that's why everybody in the 16th century debated about, is he allowed to do that? Is that even, is that art? Tullia in a sense, is anticipating, because she's writing epic, which by definition is supposed to maintain a tragic style throughout. Like there is not one single joke in the Aeneid, that because it's an epic, you don't say funny things in an epic. Ariosto like shocked people by jokes in the Orlando Furioso. But Tullia's anticipating Tasso, really, in a way. She's writing an epic which is meant to be serious and tragic throughout. She has two registers. The proem to every octave is religious. It's always a form of prayer to the Virgin, to God, to Christ. And it's always what I would call rather opaque language. The diction is very elaborate, very contorted, and when I wasn't thinking this isn't clear, I was thinking it's almost like a throw forward to some kind of Mannerist or Baroque concept of poetry. It's, you know, if you're translating, no, if you're reading Montale, you don't say, this isn't clear. You think, this is really complicated and opaque, and it's my job to interpret it as I read it. And that's the register she has in the proems by and large. And then her discursive narrating style kicks in at octave 7 or 8 of every canto. And so you see a real diversity of style, or I would say alternation between two styles that she uses. And you know, I think every reader will decide, is that a successful marriage? But I think it's a very consistent practice that she adopts. I guess the last thing I should say, because I just praised, and I will always praise Ariosto's great fluidity and the way that you can read him without stumbling or wondering or pounding your head against the wall to see what he's saying. And I mentioned this to our colleague Albert Ascoli, who is now translating Orlando Furioso for publication, and I've seen 4 of his draft canti. They're splendid. And so he was commiserating with me about the task of translating a long poem, and I said, yeah, but you know, Ariosto has that legibility, that brilliant comprehensibility, and he said, try translating him. And I said, okay, that's my assignment for the next years. I'm going to reread Orlando Furioso for the 73rd time as if I were going to translate it, and it's really hard. If you have to account for every single word on the page, it's a whole different lens to look at an author through. So I offer that as exculpation for Tullia. And I hope those of you that read it will enjoy the book. I think I would say it's a fascinating cultural artifact at the very least. It's a huge monument in the history of European women's writing, and I think it's a good read. It's a crazy story, and there are dragons, and there's a journey through heaven, hell, and purgatory, and there's everything. So buckle up.
Thank you so much. So I have a bunch of questions for you, but you've been doing this so beautifully that I decided, can you ask a question to one another? Julia, can you ask a question to John? And John, can you ask a question to Julia? You want to go first?
You ask one question of each,
Okay.
and we'll think.
Okay. So my question.
We talk so much together, through the years. Yeah.
Okay. So my first question is for you, John, especially in light of your double profile as a scholar of Italian literature and of classical antiquity. So as we have read in the poem, Tullia declares that she's not following in the footsteps of ancient philosophers and poets, I think, but does she really omit a connection with the classics, or because sometimes poets don't really follow through, don't keep their promises, and
well, she, like any like any author in the epic genre, she interacts with the supernatural constantly. For example, and she has an unwavering devotion to Christian truth. However, her Christian hero consults pagan oracles to discover the truth of his identity.
And the Sibylla.
And
Sybil.
the Sybil, yeah, she's a whole story. And there's one poem, I should have looked this up in advance, but there's one poem in which she says something sort of Apollo adjacent or Muse adjacent, but she doesn't in any way lift up pagan antiquity as a model that I can think of.
Can I add? She has obviously, once the Mauro Curzietti's volume was published, we're constantly looking back and forth between the two, and we go to a great deal of effort in the footnotes to talk about what she leaves out, what she adds. And I'll say a second about some things that she adds. But she does have a number of different metaphors in which she refers to classical authors that were not in Andrea's text. And they're sort of spattered throughout the footnotes. Not hundreds, but, maybe 10 or 15. In terms of what she adds, I think one of the things that's very interesting is that she adds psychological motivation for her characters in a way that Andrea did not. She adds also genuine interest in women's benefit, and especially the violence to which women are often subjected. And she mentions there are at least 3 or 4 instances where she talks about a character who we need to take care of her, so lest this happen. And the other thing that she does that I think contributes to the aspect that I was talking about earlier, that Guerrino is not necessarily always so likable, is that she recounts all in the third person. Whereas Andrea kind of goes back and forth between first and second, and I think this has an effect of distancing from the reader. Any kind of, although there might not be any sort of sense of identification with the author, but the fact that she does it in third person, I think, sort of distances. Something that John will talk about, because he's written an article about it, is that she spends a lot of time talking about the beauty of her hero. And I will let you, do you want to say something more about that?
Yeah, for example, she says, Andrea says that a young woman is attracted to Guerrino because he is strong and his armor is becoming to him. And Tullia puts that into poetry because he bore beauty from his cradle. So she aestheticizes Guerrino. He's supposed to be very good looking in Andrea, but Andrea doesn't elaborate on it.
Belabor the point, right. Also, as both Virginia Cox and John have noted in articles, that she has a particularly hostile attitude, the narrator has a particularly hostile attitude towards seductive women. And that's something that is obviously interesting in the idea of the penitent courtesan who's writing.
Okay, my second question was for Julia, and it concerns Tullia's relationship with vernacular sources, in particular because Guerrino enters hell and purgatory and peers into heaven, which of course recalls Dante, but also Ariosto in a much lighter way. And so I was thinking, I was wondering, do you see Tullia as closer to Dante in his theological seriousness, or to Ariosto in his lighter tone?
I think both. Am I allowed to say that? I was going to say this earlier when John was talking about her. Her narrator does have quite a few sort of ironic comments when she's describing something that you're not quite sure it's ironic at first, and that's kind of the nature of irony, I think, is this ironic or is it not? But by the same token, no, there is this sort of seriousness of purpose in which she recounts. One of the things that is also we haven't talked about, but there is quite a bit of religious controversy in her attitude, both towards there's a lot of anti-Islamic polemics in the text, including she goes out of her way and adopts 2 alternative biographies of Muhammad I've said this the other day. I'm interested in what do we call the topos by which we say that what it is that we're writing was based on an earlier written source? I don't know the name of that topos, but it appears everywhere. And she has that. And in her recounting the biography, when Guerrino is going to see the tomb of Muhammad, the narrator says, the book that I was reading said these things, but I have a different idea. And then she goes into she uses both John of Mandeville's travels as well as a French text, which was, Then there was another text by Juan Andrés, which is called it's called the Opera Chiamata Confusioni della Secta Mahometana, which was it was both written in Castilian and was immediately translated into Italian in 1515. And there are certain details in her recounting that allow us to see that was the source that she was drawing on. So she had these 2 alternative texts that were simply there. I mean, they were sort of interesting ideas about how Muhammad was first an epileptic camel driver, and then the other one about how there were, 7 captains who took care of the problems that we're having in a city of Corondario, which appears only there. And about that's one thing I wanted to say, was that if someone, there are graduate students out there, want to look into an interesting thing to do would be to find out which version of Andrea's text she read, because it was extremely popular, was published beginning in 1473 and was published and republished again throughout the 16th century, especially after Trent. Then there are parts, for example, the visit to the Sibyl is excerpted, or the Sibyl is called by Alcina, speaking of Ariosto. It would be interesting to see, because one of the things that we noticed are the differing place names that she uses. There's been extensive work on Andrea's place names, so there are sort of list of them to go through. We don't know whether she knew that, she never mentions the name Andrea, and there were quite a few early publications of the Meschino that were not, that didn't have his name in it. They were not, it did never appear. But the difference in the place names would be an interesting work to see which text she was using, I think. But
by the
anyway.
way, the anxiety of influence shows up clearly in, the fact that she doesn't name Andrea. In fact, she doesn't even admit that she uses an Italian source. She says, I decided to translate into poetry a Spanish text that I found. There is a Spanish text, but her word choices are identical to Andrea's in countless passages, so there's no question she knew Andrea. However, while we're at it, Ariosto never once in his life says Boiardo. Right. So, it's fine for a great author to say, I will ignore my source, or I will lie about my source and say that it's a source different than it actually is. So, yeah.
Thank you. So both of you. So since the times of Dionisotti, we have known that women intellectuals in the central decades of the 16th century formed a community and were conscious of being a community. So my question is, how did Tullia interact with that community, and if this interaction had an impact on the Meschino? Because she's rewriting, as you was mentioning, she's rewriting a work originally written by a man and engaging with literary tradition that is deeply shaped by male authors, yet she is also operating in a moment of unprecedented visibility on the literary stage for women and on the intellectual stage. So, this is my question. How does she deal with this tension?
Well, for one, I think we have to think about the number one doyen of 16th century Italian letters at the time, which is Vittorio Colonna. And I think it's probably very clear that Tullia read Vittorio Colonna. We've seen examples of Gaspara Stampa reading Tullia. I think Joanna Wernquist has written about that. One of the things that is fascinating to me about Tullia and about Italian society in general at this time is the extent to which courtesans may or may have not interacted with noble women. And there's a very interesting letter that Battista Stabellino is writing. He is an informant of Isabella d'Este, who is in Ferrara. And he is writing a letter about the arrival of Tullia in Ferrara in June of 1537. And he later goes on to tell a tale of a young man who was terribly in love with Tullia and wanted to marry her. And she said to him, and this sort of quip of hers has returned several times in her works, of that, "I'm not here for that." So she's not interested. And there's one evening in which he's going to come to dinner, and supposedly his sister and sister-in-law are going to be coming to this dinner, to Tullia's house. It actually turns out that this did not happen. They waited and waited. Dinner was ready. They waited and waited. These women did not show up. And later that night, they end up having dinner, and then he pulls out a string of pearls and wants her to marry him, and she says, "No, I'm not interested." And then in this grand gesture, he stabs himself to show him how in love he is with her and how he must have her. And she leaves the room and lets him bleed, puts a guard in front of the door all night. And the next morning, his family comes and gets him. But the part of that story that I think is interesting, above the drama, is the fact that it was believable that these two women would have come and had dinner with her. I wonder to what extent. We really don't know a lot at all about the possibility of their interactions. Some scholars have said incorrectly, for example, that she met Vittorio Colonna, because they were both in Ferrara at the time listening to the sermons of Bernardo Ochino. And in fact, Tullia has a poem to Ochino. But we don't know. So those of you who've seen Dangerous Beauty and that scene where supposedly Veronica Franco comes in and gives a talking to all these Venetian noblewomen, please know that that's totally false. So the community also, she was a number of Tullia's main interactions are with men, I will say that, surprisingly enough.
It is worth saying in this context, it's a great question, and I, again, learned a lot from your answer. It's not my field in a sense, but when I was in graduate school at Yale starting in 1976, my cohort received a reading list to start working on for our comps 4 years later, and it was like 10 pages, single-spaced, of major Italian authors. Vittoria Colonna was the only woman before Matilde Serrao, with the possible exception of the, so one great noblewoman of the 16th century and then a novelist of the 19th century. No women in between. The possible exception of the compiuta donzella, the learned maiden in the Sicilian school, but there were critics, male critics at the time saying, oh, that's a male author in a female voice. So, and nobody knows the name of the compiuta donzella if she existed. So, and in my lifetime, we suddenly are naming dozens of women writers. And I used to think, well, it's normal that a person is super, super famous in their lifetime, but then are forgotten after their death because, you know, most people couldn't name more than 2 kings of England, and who could be more important than a king of England in his own lifetime. But the disappearance of a very numerous and distinguished cohort of female artists in the Renaissance is not explicable only by attrition. You know, somebody just said in the intervening centuries, no, we're not interested in that. We'll republish this book, but not that book. So I think it's a really powerful question.
Have a last question before opening to the Q&A. So for both of you, as editor and translator, what is the strangest or most striking thing you encountered in this poem? A word, a line, or a stanza that truly surprised you, something that gave you serious trouble, or perhaps made you despair, or even laugh out loud?
I'm going to take your question and make it into the question that I want, which is, what is one of my most favorite parts of this text? And again, it comes from the preface. This is the opening of the preface, which in fact is something that also distinguishes it from preceding epics. At the time, people were being told not to write poems, not to write prefaces, and here we have. So this is Tullia, and this again relates to the question I mentioned earlier about the importance of reading. A topic near and dear to my heart, and one that I think we all think about a lot these days as we sit and look at our phones. So it is entitled, Tullia d'Aragona to her readers. Of all the honorable and delight, and John, I have to say just before, John has done a magisterial translation of this work, and it is thanks to him that also I was able to understand part of this poem that sometimes was quite difficult, but you can hear his incredible voice here, and Tullia's. Of all the honorable and delightful pastimes which human beings may have, it is very clear from experience that none is as beautiful and Sorry, I got to take my glasses off to read this. None is as beneficial and enjoyable as that which comes from reading happy and pleasant things. All other pastimes require either the participation of other people, and thus cannot be enjoyed continuously, nor when and how we wish, or methods which are wearying or tiresome, such as eating, drinking, and other such things, or risks, mental fatigue, expense, and often harmful and unpleasant outcomes, such as bustling about, games, love affairs, and many other such things which it is not necessary to detail here at greater length. In reading, on the other hand, we can direct ourselves independently, following our own will entirely, whether alone, in company, briefly, or at length, without expense, risk, harm, or fatigue, and to our own full satisfaction and happiness. I'll stop there.
Questions from you? See one here.
I have two, but I'll just start with the one that I am most interested in. I'd love to hear more about the character who was in between genders, and is there ever a time where they are actually in between genders, like almost like a non-binary, or just specifically male-female?
Do you want to answer that? You want me
You go.
It's the narrator, and it's never. It's either male or female. Yeah.
There's a. If I wanted to send somebody to read one octave of the poem, which I think is very artful, it would be in the proem of Canto 3, 3-3. And I'm not looking at it, but allora.
It's marked. Right there.
Well, I'll read the English, but then I'll point out the thing in the Italian that's really very, very inventive. Love and piety so inspire me not to abandon this beginning now that I have started, even though it was difficult for me to find the paths of elegant speech, that I am determined to bloody swords, break lances, and show myself changed into a bold man, though I am still a woman, and thus I return to my story. Now, in the Italian, she says, Io son disposta a insanguinar le spade. I am disposed, clearly feminine. Romper le lance e mostrarmi converso, and make myself converted, masculine, in uomo ardito, ancor che donna io sia. So the masculines are sandwiched between two feminines for the voice of the narrator. And I think that's super, super stylish.
And then my other question was on the translation. You had mentioned that she distorts the word order to create a rhyme. And so when you're translating, do you correct that word order to make sense in English? And do you ever try and like make it rhyme in English or just let that go?
No, I didn't do any rhymes in English. I have a sort of ethical translator's challenge because it doesn't, Boccaccio says a man should, no, Castiglione says it's not becoming for a person to speak in praise of oneself. But Italian scholars, whose names I don't know, but they read the volume to sort of vet it before it went to publication, said that they found there were many passages in which they understood the Italian only by looking at my English. So I think, did I falsify Tullia? Because if a native speaker reads it and wonders, did he see the beautiful woman or did the beautiful woman see him? And that happens, 12 times in every canto. Was she doing the job? Should she have her license revoked? But I think, especially in, again, if it were Cavalcanti, you'd say, well, of course, that's opaque, and you can't translate it in a way that it just makes sense like a phone book. But when you're telling a story, you expect the story to be fluid and to know who killed the dragon and stuff like that. But I also think, a committed reader is used to interpreting and making sense of things that are challenging. So I think, was she anticipating a less fluent kind of narration? Possibly, and I think critics can debate that in times to come.
I would add to that we really don't know. The poem is complete, right? And she died with her mind intact, but her body infirm. That says so in her last will and testament. It may well be that part of the issues that John has been discussing that bothered him might have been corrected if she had, she died relatively young, in her maybe early 50s. The other thing I would think, I wasn't the translator, but I do want to answer this, because I think English doesn't allow you to do the things that Italian does. And so it would be interesting to see, there is someone who's translating parts of the text into French, and it would be interesting to look and see what they're doing, and if they're maintaining, because in English, you basically can't have the subject come afterwards, except in very artful ways. that it doesn't occur as often as it would, say, in a Romance language.
Alison?
So thank you. This is a lot of fun. So is there some doubt about the authorship, or isn't there? I'm not clear on that because, I mean, clearly you're sure, but what's the status of that question?
So the question of her authorship being put in doubt was first posed in 1891 by Enrico Celani, who was the editor of her choral anthology. He edited it in such a way that he completely, and Ann Jones pointed this out a long time ago, dismantled the whole structure that I talked to you about. He completely dismantled it. And he's the first person to put into question her authorship. And in it, he simply questions her authorship of the preface. And a couple of different men in the late 19th century, early 20th century have taken that and sort of run with it. So other people have talked about Andreoli, about her not writing the dialogue, or more recently, the two, let's say, most authoritative voices that have discussed it, for one, is Virginia Cox, who has brought up a series of issues of which, why is it that it's not being, what's the word I want? There's no patron, and there's no one to which it's being dedicated in the way that most epics at the time were. She has problems with the question of the oscillation of the gender of the narrator. Other people have not with that. I mean, and Guido Sacchi, who has written about mid-century epic, as well as Eugenio, do you know how to pronounce the name of the woman who wrote the book? There's a woman who wrote a book about mid-century epic in particular, who they both took that as being something that was part and parcel of the text. So the other question that was the fact that the dedication of the book is by a certain person called Claudio Rinieri, and he's dedicating it to Giulio della Valle. And for a long time, people said, well, we don't know who this Claudio Rinieri is. More recently, also thanks to Ida, who he was the son of Antonio Rinieri, a poet, a Sienese poet from Colle, Valdelsa. It may well be, my theory is that Antonio Rinieri, who was, Claudio was very young at the time. He was maybe 14. It's not unheard of to have 14-year-olds writing things like that, but it may well be that this was a move on the part of his father to help promote his son and get him into Della Valle's household by having him, help author him this letter. So that's sort of has been a conundrum that I think has been solved. Although, we don't have a smoking gun. It was published posthumously. The big issue, I think, and I've written an article about this about the attribution of the text, is that people had also said there was no contemporary reference to it. That's not true. There was a poem in the end of her choral anthology in which someone is talking about, and now that she has turned her attention, volgere is the verb they use, to Calliope and Clio. So, there we have the muse of epic poetry and of history. So to me, that's pretty clear indication. There's another poem of hers that talks about her, I can't remember what it is now, so whatever.
The issue of the dedication, I think, is irrelevant because it was published posthumously. She did not curate the first edition personally in any way.
Right. And so the question is, if it wasn't Tullia, who was it? And why did no one from 1561 to 1891 say anything different or bring it up? Or I would like to see some sort of documentary evidence that if it's not her, who was it and why? I mean, was it just simply trying to publish a poem under a woman's name because they thought that it would be, and a woman who was dead so that she couldn't say, I didn't write that book? I mean, that's where it stands, really.
Hi, so I have a question about the translation because I'm completely unfamiliar with the process. So you mentioned the challenge when you encountered, like, I believe you mentioned a Latin word that like refers to like multiple pronouns. So I guess like when you encountered that challenge, what was your process like in figuring out what exactly Tullia was trying to say?
One is just reading the passage out loud over and over and over until it started to make sense. But I want to underscore how helpful it was. The critical edition by Cursietti of Tullia's source text, the Andrea da Barberino, Il Guerrino, it came out in 2005, and I drafted in 2003. So when I was in a position to compare my draft to his story, in many, many cases, first of all, I could tell that he was her source text because there are thousands of passages in which she uses the exact vocabulary that he uses. So there's no question that she may be translated it from the Spanish. No, she used Andrea, but his word order, it's prose. So he just says, Guerrino shot the elephant. You don't wonder if the elephant shot Guerrino. But it's very, that was hugely helpful. And I should say what I think in the long run for the Academy may be more crucial about this volume is the Italian critical edition that Julia has curated. Because this book was really, I mean, you could find a photocopy of the 1561 if you knew the right people, or there was one other edition in 1839 that was not a scholarly edition and is also almost impossible to find. So the poem was going to disappear, but the other voice series for several years said it's so long that we can only publish it in English. It was not going to be a bilingual edition, and Julia did all the politicking and strategizing to make that happen. So I think that's a huge achievement. And it made it possible for us to eliminate hundreds and hundreds of my notes in which I said, I'm not sure I'm getting this right, or others may disagree. If somebody knows Italian better than I do, they look at the left-hand page and they can decide if I was right or not. But, and I just did a very, again, because I was being interrupted all the time and I was approaching it as an artisan, not an artist, so I was just like plowing through. The metaphor of the plow is appropriate this week. So I just started at page 1 and I went to page 400 or whatever it was in order. One more dissertation that might be written by someone in this room. There are two very significant inconsistencies in the plot if you assume that Tullia was reading Andrea, which she was. She omits the death of the antagonist in the early canti. So Astiladoro, who's the wicked Saracen king who besieges Constantinople, Andrea tells us how he died years later, but Tullia skips that. And then the Guerrino's best friend Alessandro, the Byzantine prince, goes home to Constantinople because of this or that, and then 50 pages later, he walks into the room and says ciao, or whatever he says. And in Andrea, that is fully explained. Like, he went home, he did this, and then 6 months later, he found out where Guerrino was. And so I think I've noticed that Cursietti does not mention any edition or a print edition or manuscript of the Andrea that would account for those discrepancies. So either that book no longer exists, or I don't know. I mean, it's like it could be that there might have been a post-it in her manuscript that was lost, or a page could have dropped out at the printers or something, or she might just have gotten busy. But I would be surprised if we found a copy of Andrea that had those two lacunae in it.
Thank you.
Hi, I had a question, and I know in the discussion we talked a lot about how her epic was very distinct and unique from the epics that came before it. So my question was what was the Tullia's biggest impact on works after her?
What was her biggest?
What was Tullia's her works biggest impact on works after her?
Well, I've never pondered this question, but I think the fact that women in her time then started writing epics is an influence. I haven't studied them in comparison with her text.
I think we would have to say that the Dialogue on the Infinity of Love is the book that she wrote that had the biggest impact, not the Meschino. For one, it was republished several times during her lifetime and afterwards. And the Meschino was published once in 1561 and not again until the edition that John mentioned in 1839. So the actual hero is is all over the place in Italian culture. I mean, even in terms of, there's more recently, Gesualdo Bufalino wrote something he called a fable that has Guerrino as a character. Guerrino is a puppet who appears also not as we speak necessarily, because it's done in the summer, but in Sicilian puppet theater. There's the Guerin Sportivo, a journal. There was a film that totally redid the plot, where one of his he falls in love with the daughter of the emperor in the court in which he was raised, or which he spent a certain amount of his young adulthood. And at one point, she says something that upsets him. That she calls him a villano, like a contadino, someone who does. And she makes a point about saying, "You don't even know where you're from." And his love dissipates pretty quickly after that scene. But why was I telling that story? Huh? Ah, right. In the film, they get married. So,
Thank you both. I have a question, sort of a translation question. Something I was thinking about also as some of the English is being read aloud. So this being a work of the 16th century and now translating it in the 21st, beginning in the 21st century, I'm curious if in the translation process you made a concerted effort to apply or maybe to avoid what you might have considered to be let's say a 16th century conceit to your English. If you had to, if within the course of the translation, maybe certain things came out, maybe certain words, this or that, you felt compelled to, or maybe you even saw a little bit of, I don't know, Milton or something. There's verse poetry, right? And you're like, oh, so this is sort of her time period or comparative, or if you thought it would have been disingenuous to do so and you chose instead to maybe write it more in your own idiom.
I didn't do any conscious archaizing. I didn't write it, I don't use thee and thou, and I didn't place it in any kind of 16th century English context. It does raise a very interesting point, and this is untranslatable. This is exclusively footnotable. But Tullia herself, and again, I originally thought these were errors in her culture. Then I decided at a certain point that these were stylemes. She uses non-standard grammar sometimes, and she does it only in clusters. Like there will be a page where she does it 5 times, and then she doesn't do it for another 300 pages. But she will, by the standards of 16th century grammar, which she perfectly follows in the preface, she will mismatch gender of noun and adjective. And I was very weirded out by that when I first encountered it. But then I thought, well, Andrea does that all the time. You know, he'll say like, la donna intelligento or something. You know, it's just like, what? You can't do that. But so he'll do that because the grammar was not standardized to the level it was in the 16th century. And Tullia does it like she's sprinkling salt into the text. But you can't translate that in English because adjectives don't have to match nouns anyway. But that's an example of her, I think, very consciously seasoning her text to sound archaic.
I just wanted to know in what ways, if any, does Tullia's work and her ideas of Christianity and virtue reflect the developing ideas of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations at the time in the 16th century?
In every way, shape, and form. I mean, for sure. She says that. She even says something at a certain point about blasphemous ideas taking place in the church. She, at a certain point, uses the term a viva confession, which was auricular confession, which was something that was being talked about at the time that she was probably writing, was being talked about at Trent and was mandated on. So I think she is absolutely a product of the time in which she lived, as almost all of us are. And you see that in the text. I think she emphasizes his sort of virtuous religious nature more than Andrea does.
She does something that's very weird in those terms, and it doesn't make her more Catholic or less Catholic, because she's clearly very interested in sustaining the Roman Church and its dignity. But when Guerrino dies at the end of the poem, this is like practically the last line of the poem, his soul is seen by everyone present going up to heaven. Andrea doesn't say that, and it's extremely unorthodox theologically, and it just makes you go, huh? But, you know, a lot of people say Vittoria Colonna died just in time not to be considered a heretic. And, you know, Michelangelo and she were talking like Lutherans a lot of the time, and Tullia was breathing that air.
One last question.
There's one right there.
So one aspect of Tullia's poetry that you mentioned was like sort of unique for her was that she rhymed Latin and Italian, and she sort of like interchanged them. But like from what I know, there were many other epic poets at the time who also used both Latin and Italian in their poetry. So like, was there anything about her rhyming that made it unique to her, or was it similar to?
No, and in fact, I need to remind myself, but at someplace in the Divine Comedy, Dante rhymes Latin with Italian, and perhaps the way that Tullia does it, which is in the context of quoting a Latin prayer. So I mentioned the verb intende, and that's when you say, "Oh God, hear," or listen. So she does it in a very restricted way. She doesn't do it often. She does it maybe once or twice in the poem.
But above and beyond that, we have a man, Cornelio Frangipane, who lives in Venice, and he writes point blank that Tullia knew Latin really well, and was very well spoken in the vernacular as well as in Latin.
Thank you very much. We're out of time. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Julia.